Hi, I'm Cameron,
And I'm Hayden.
and this is...
Until the End of Crime.
Is there someone who you didn't know, like a celebrity, whose death really impacted you?
As a child or at any point in time?
Any point in time.
I think there's like two.
Okay.
And honestly, more than that, and it might be more of a collective mourning, the first time I can really understand that is reading stories in school, like The Diary of Anne Frank or Night by Eli Wiesel.
Mm-hmm.
And in both of those instances, I remember being really emotional as I learned more about the Holocaust and what they suffered.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that Anne Frank died at a concentration camp was gutting. It was awful. I remember being really emotional about that. And then in the next instance where something like that happened is when I discovered Matthew Shepard.
Yeah.
The only reason I discovered Matthew Shepard is because when I came out to my mom, she was like, "I don't want you to be a Matthew Shepard." And I was like, "Who's Matthew Shepard?" I thought it was someone she knew.
Yeah.
And of course, she gave me the worst version. I mean, that story is awful.
It is awful. It is
awful regardless of circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
But she gave me the most horrifying version of that story.
Did she exaggerate some things?
I'm sure she did.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Love her much, but she loves to tell a story.
It's on brand, yeah.
She loves to weave a yarn.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I learned more about it, that was really terrifying. I was like, oh God, I don't want this for me either. It wasn't until 2021 I read a book called All the Young Men by Ruth Coker Burks. And she detailed her time as an Arkansas native during the AIDS epidemic and how poorly AIDS victims were being treated in Arkansas. And of course, we know they were being treated poorly across the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and she outlined how there were so many instances where these AIDS patients that she would go to visit would share with her that they had contacted their family, or she asked them to contact their family. And the family would just say, that person is dead, or that's not my son. And she would essentially be the person that cared for them in those situations. And she talked about how those families wouldn't even bury their own dead son. And she would have them cremated, and she interred their ashes on her own family property in Arkansas. And she made appeals to President Clinton, who she knew personally. And, well, not necessarily personally, but family knew family.
They're Arkansas, yeah.
And how she was ostracized. A cross was burned on her yard. Her daughter was bullied for it, if I remember correctly. And a lot of the stories of those different young men that she helped were really emotional. It was almost a difficult book to finish.
Yeah.
And it kind of led me down a road of reading more and more and more about the AIDS epidemic. So, although no, not a famous person, there are instances where the death of someone I didn't know has impacted me.
Okay.
Is that the answer you were expecting?
No, because all of yours are like, you found out after the fact, not somebody that you were aware of in real time, but it does answer my question. But I think I was maybe putting more credence on the, like, a celebrity part.
Well, I did watch Rock Hudson, a documentary on him and his death and struggle with AIDS, and that was horrible and terrible and awful. And he's famous, was famous. I think he died before I was alive.
Yeah, all of your people have basically died before you were 10.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I have one more and I can't forget. His name was Pedro Zamora. He did not die before I was alive, and he was a celebrity because I believe he was the first openly gay housemate on The Real World.
Mm-hmm.
And if he wasn't the first openly gay housemate, he was the first housemate to be openly HIV positive. And there were roommates that were so unkind to him.
Yeah.
And questioned whether or not they could even shower in the same place he had showered.
Yeah.
And of course, we're talking about the mid-90s.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't a great understanding of AIDS or its transmission.
Right.
And I only discovered him because assigned a project to all Spanish 3 students.
Mm-hmm.
and you had to pick a famous Mexican celebrity or activist and do a research project on them. He gave us like a prefabricated list of Mexican nationals that we could pick, and Pedro Zamora was on that list. And I don't know what drew me to it. I don't know if it was on there that he had AIDS or what, but I ended up picking him, and that was also really emotional. I was not even, well, I was at terms with my sexuality, but I was still going through a lot.
Right.
It was just weird. And then I also had to like do the presentation on him out loud. And I remember Senor kept laughing as I was giving the most devastating talk about Pedro Zamora because the button on my shorts kept popping open. And I would try to covertly close it, and it would just pop right back open. And he just kept laughing as I detailed how this man struggled in this house, and then he did die. And there was just Senor and the whole rest of the class laughing in the background.
Oh my gosh.
As my shorts kept exploding. Did you have one of those?
You always give me like some answer that's way, way, way beyond what my answer is. And I'm just going to say this because my sister loves to bring this up. So when I was young, I loved Britney Spears when I was young. Big Britney Spears fan. And my cousin, he was very big Justin Timberlake fan, which didn't age well. But there was some tabloid or some report came out that they had been in a car accident and had both died. And he and I were so upset because I was at my grandma's when this happened. And we were both like, my sister likes to say that we were both crying. I don't remember crying, but like, I guess.
You were bereft.
We were very upset because we both were big fans and they were dating and da-da-da-da-da. And yeah, so that's where I'm going to go with that. But I do have a hard time consuming any information about Selena without crying.
Oh.
I mean, obviously, like when Michael died, when Whitney died, when Kobe died, all of those things were...
None of those affected me.
I mean, I didn't call out of work or anything.
Yeah.
But it's tragic in all of those cases in different ways, right?
Right.
But no, not Anne Frank for me. I've never read it. Maybe if I had. I did read Night, but that one didn't get me either. My sister actually asked me about that on Friday. She was like, what was that book by some woman? And I was like, I know she's talking about Night. I know she's talking about Night, and that is not a woman. But, you know, Ely.
Mm-hmm.
Especially for somebody that was 15 at the time.
I read that shit in 7th grade.
Yeah, we read it in 10th grade. And she was like, yeah, there was a scene where they were standing in line behind somebody and they had gotten their period and there was just blood. And I was like, yeah, that's not a female author. Are there any deaths that you can think of or that you've heard of somebody well known that has impacted maybe society or a large demographic?
I remember my mom being really upset about the death of Princess Diana.
Okay, yeah, I think that is up there.
Candle in the Wind.
Yeah. Let me tell you about Jill Dando.
Jill Dando.
Mm-hmm.
Am I supposed to recognize her name right off the bat?
No.
Okay.
Jill Dando had always been drawn to television. She shared in an interview that even at the age of 8, she would go to the library and check out books about TV. She was destined to become a notable television personality. She was born in Weston-super-Mare and involved herself in theater during her adolescence.
Weston-super-Mare?
Weston-super-Mare.
Where's that?
England.
Oh, okay. An English story. Got it. Okay.
At 18, she volunteered at Sunshine Radio Hospital. Her first job in journalism was when she worked for the local newspaper, that Weston Mercury.
What are all of these names? What is the Sunshine Radio Hospital?
Well, I think there's a hospital that had a...
Sunshine Radio in it?
That had a radio station.
That's weird. Okay.
It said radio, so I assumed that it was some sort of thing where she was around the production of a show, if not a part of it.
But at a hospital?
Yeah. I'm
so confused.
It's fine. It's not
it's
really...
Fine.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't.
Okay.
Okay. Her first job in journalism was when she worked for the local newspaper, the Weston Mercury. And Journalism ran in her family because both her father, Jack, and her brother, Nigel, had worked there, and that was likely how she was able to get her foot in the door. But that is not to take away anything from how hard Jill worked or her skillfulness to command an audience.
So they might have helped her get her foot in the door, but her skill was apparent.
Well, she belonged there.
Yeah,
She belonged in journalism.
Good.
And after 5 years of working for the newspaper, she transitioned in 1985 from print journalism into reading news for BBC Radio Devon.
Ooh.
Shortly after Jill turned 24, Jill and Nigel lost their mother to leukemia in January 1986.
That's sad.
It is sad. And it doesn't inform anything really, but it didn't feel okay to leave out.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it may not necessarily contribute to whatever you're going to tell me, but I do think it's important that we understand her family dynamic.
Mm-hmm. By early 1988, Jill was ready to move to London to take on television and a new look.
I love that Jill is a go-getter.
And she's in the field that she belongs in. She'd been interested in this since she was a child. As a child, were you going to learn about your future career, checking out books about social work at 8 years old?
No, definitely. Weird that you said social work, because that was not on my...
I know. But that's,
so no, I definitely wasn't looking
but that's
for...
kind of my point. She knew from a young age what she wanted to do and where she was supposed to be. She was working for the BBC, on air for BBC One and BBC Two, doing short, hourly news reporting. And like I said, when she moved, she knew she needed a new look. She had been told she looked, quote-unquote, regional.
Okay, what does that mean?
I think it means...
Like, does something typify that region?
No, I just think it means, like, maybe more plain. I don't know. The only time I've ever really heard anybody say it is RuPaul on on Drag Race UK Series 2. Was it Series 2 or was it Series 1? It was Series 2. It was Tia Coffee. She said it too.
Yeah, I don't know. But I understand what you're saying because I've heard it in the same context.
I've only ever heard about it in relation to the BBC, is
Yeah.
what I'm saying.
There you go.
Yeah. So she dyed her brown hair blonde. She sported a newer, shorter haircut, which ended up becoming trendy. And I'm going to credit her with that.
Good. She deserves it.
She lost weight. All of this in order to look more the part of a major network journalist. Between 1986 and the mid-90s, she ended up being the presenter on quite a few shows. Breakfast Time, Breakfast News, the BBC 1 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, Holiday, which was a travel show, and occasionally Songs of Praise. Jill had been raised Baptist, and her religion remained a very important part of her life. In 1995, she started hosting Crime Watch. Are you familiar with Crime Watch?
No.
No?
I don't think so. Is it an English show?
It is an English show.
Nope. Don't know it.
All right. Well, it is a monthly show that recreated major unsolved crime cases in the UK in hopes that it would renew interest in and conversations around these crimes in hopes of helping to solve them.
Okay.
It ran from June 1984 to March 2017.
Wow. It's a long-running television show.
And it did produce some of the desired results. About a third of the cases that were recreated for the show were solved.
Wow, a third?
A third. And about half of those case closings directly resulted from people watching the show and calling in tips or information that they may have had or not realized they had until the show aired.
That's incredible.
Yeah. Especially considering the time that the show ran, to say that a third of those cases were solved and that a sixth of the cases that they covered throughout that June 1984 to March 2017 were closed as a result of the show.
Yeah, what is that, like 17% of all their cases?
Around there.
Yeah.
Like 16.5%.
Yeah.
16.75%. Some of the most notorious crimes in British history have been solved through airing episodes on Crime Watch. Jill Dando's regular presence in so many British households meant that she was finally doing what she set out to do. And so she was able to focus more on her personal life. As I mentioned before, Jill was on BBC in the late 80s and early 90s. She also was romantically involved with a BBC executive from 1989 to 1996. Bob Wheaton. She had a short romance with a national park warden named Simon Bassel that fell between her relationship with Wheaton and December 1997, when she went on a blind date with a gynecologist named Alan Farthing, who was separated from his wife at the time.
I am going to say this cautiously.
Okay.
I love the name Farthing. It's so odd. Farthing.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope he's not the killer.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
You're allowed to like a name.
Okay. So killer. Got it.
Alan Farthing, as I mentioned, gynecologist.
Yeah.
And he later went on to become the Queen's gynecologist.
I also think that male gynecologists are odd. Anyways, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
Probably has a good snatch game.
Really knows how to work a speculum.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. But the Queen's. Just take a moment. Think about that. This was the Queen's gynecologist. Not at the time that they dated, but...
I mean, she was rubbing elbows with some impressive people.
Yes.
A BBC exec, the guy in the middle.
The park warden.
Oh, the park warden. Was it the Queen's Park?
No word.
Are they all the Queen's Park?
I think they might all be they were all the Queen's Park.
Once upon a time.
Anyway, Alan and Jill had moved in together and announced their engagement on January 31st, 1999.
Oh, okay.
After his divorce was finalized.
So this was serious.
Yes. They set the date of their wedding for September 25th of the same year.
Was she still on BBC at this time?
Yes.
Okay.
The week of April 24th, 1999, Jill was featured on the cover of Radio Times magazine. She'd been booked to co-host the 1999 British Academy Television Awards, which would take place May 9th. And on April 23rd, she wrapped the filming of the show Antiques Inspectors, and the first episode aired April 25th. The following morning, Jill left Alan's apartment and drove to her house on Gowan Avenue. Since moving in with Alan, she hadn't been spending much time at her house. She didn't visit it frequently, and she was in the process of selling it. She was just heading there for contract documents that had been faxed to her there. And as she approached her front door at 11:32
PM?
a.m.,
Okay.
Jill Dando was shot once in the back of the head.
Oh my God. Like as she was entering her property?
Yes.
Her home?
Right as she was on her doorstep, basically.
And she was shot in the back of the head.
In the back of the head.
I assume this is like a busy London street?
No, I don't believe so. It's a residential area.
Okay.
Not busy. Because at 11:46, which is 14 minutes later, her neighbor Helen Doble came upon the body of Jill and phoned the police.
Oh no.
She was pronounced deceased upon her arrival at the hospital 91 minutes after arriving at her front door. Britain was devastated. They had grieved Princess Diana's death a year and a half prior, and now they were collectively losing another major figure.
So if you were going to liken her to somebody that's American, could we say maybe like Ryan Seacrest or, well, I guess she did news, but also television. Like I'm going through this, is it like a Drew Carey? Is it like an Oprah Winfrey?
I would maybe go Oprah. That's what I was thinking.
Okay.
Oprah.
Okay, Oprah's a big deal.
I know.
Okay.
But it would also be like we had just lost a beloved first lady the year prior, or like, and they didn't look dissimilar, especially with her new look. Jill Dando and Princess Diana, they had similar aesthetics.
Okay. That makes sense.
Which is just a parallel. That's not really mentioned. It was mentioned, though, multiple times in Netflix's Who Killed Jill Dando, how if Princess Di was the people's rose, Jill Dando was the people's sunflower. Several people likened her death to that of Princess Diana's, so I want to make sure that I convey that she was a beloved staple in many people's daily life.
Yeah, it sounds like she had tremendous value to the people of the UK.
Well, she graced their screens several times a day. The 2 breakfast shows, the 1 o'clock show, the 6 o'clock show. She was on some of the evening programming, the primetime programming.
I bet she was exhausted.
Probably, but I think she was really loving her life.
I'm sure.
There was a scene in the documentary where she's at this, what looks to be a gala, and she's just living her life. You can tell that she feels like a princess. Like she feels appreciative and special, and she's not taking what's going on around her for granted.
Right.
But yeah, she was just a very enamoring figure
Right.
for the people.
Well, she was TV royalty, I suppose, at that point.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, she'd been on their screens consistently for what, like 7 years?
Yeah.
No, more than that.
The better part of a decade.
More than a decade, right?
The better part of more than a decade.
So yeah, the decision was made to halt the airing of Antiques Inspectors, but later that year, the network did decide to release the episodes in order to honor Jill and the work that she had put into them.
I'm glad. I'm glad they decided that. Not totally related, but there was an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the 90s that was literally set to air the same week as Columbine.
Oh.
And it was a school shooter episode. And when I look back on the history of like television in the United States, especially in the period of like the 90s, that happened more than once. Like there were instances where these terrible crimes occurred, and it was like right at the time an episode was supposed to air that dealt with a similar situation.
Yeah.
And so I know it's not totally the same, but I do think it's an exercise in good judgment to say, I think maybe we ought to pull this episode or these episodes for this period of time.
Yeah. Well, I think that the people needed the time to grieve, but then after 5 months or 4.5 months or however the math actually works out, that it was a way for them to still celebrate her and show their respect for her and for what she did, and to give them those final few episodes.
Yeah, I think it would be really unsettling to know that someone had just died and then to see their new episode that same week.
Oh, yeah.
So,
But it would also feel wrong to know that there were episodes that no one ever got to see.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be like hiding her legacy.
Right. During the autopsy of Jill, it was determined that the shooter had held the gun to her head at the time that they pulled the trigger. Richard Hughes, the next-door neighbor to Jill's house on Gowan Avenue, heard a woman scream, but he chalked it up to someone surprising someone else.
Who was the woman screaming?
Jill?
I mean, she was shot in the head.
She screamed. Right. He didn't hear a gunshot, but he did look out the window, and not realizing that Jill lay near her front door with a gunshot wound, he saw a 6-foot-tall white man walking away from the scene.
Oh my God. So he heard the scream after she was shot, and a 6-foot-tall white man was walking away.
Mm-hmm.
How tall was Alan Farthing?
The man who went on to become the gynecologist of the
Queen's
Queen.
Gyne? Yeah.
I don't know if I put this in here,
Uh-huh.
but it was something that stood out to me when I was researching it, so I'm surprised that it's not right here. But I said that the forensic pathologist determined that the shooter had held the gun to her head. So part of the reason that there was no audible gunshot is because in doing that and holding it flush to the head, it created the same type of silencing that a suppressor, or I think what's more commonly called a silencer, does.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So he used her own skull to silence the gunshot.
That's a remarkably close distance to shoot someone at.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, if he did it from afar, would she have screamed, or would she have just, I mean, she was shot in the head. I think she knew in the split second before that somebody was there and meant to do her harm.
Okay.
And then,
well, that makes more sense if she
Yeah.
felt that on the back of her head before the
Right.
shot was fired.
right.
That must have been a terrifying split second.
Yeah. As you can imagine, the media covered this case extensively. She was one of their own. Britain's sweetheart reporter, savagely slain on her own doorstep. But for over a year, the Met was unable to make any progress in identifying the man Richard Hughes had seen fleeing the scene.
The Met?
Yeah, the Metropolitan Police.
Oh, okay.
The Met.
I didn't know that's what they were referred to as.
Sorry, I forget that you're not British.
Yeah, as are most people.
With Jill being such a public figure, potential motives were innumerable, and she had met hundreds, if not thousands, of people, reaching at least that many on a regular basis. So, after being unable to find any solid leads within the first 12 months of their investigation, they found a person of interest. Barry George lived in close-ish proximity to Jill Dando's house, the one that she visited infrequently. And George had a history of stalking and other unfavorable behavior.
Was this history of stalking Jill Dando?
I don't think so.
Okay. So, I mean, we know that doing things like that can lead to other troubling behaviors.
Yes.
It seems a bit like a leap right now.
Yeah. They did determine that he matched the psychological profile of someone who might be responsible for committing a crime like this.
Mm-hmm.
In late May 2000, they started watching George. And 3 days later, they arrested him for Jill's murder.
Oh my God. Well, that was quick.
Very fast turnaround. 13 months later, in July 2001, George was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison.
Okay, I feel like I'm missing some context.
Yeah, I think the police were too.
Okay. Like, did they say why they arrested him other than the psychological profile?
Maybe.
What, did the Queen's gynecologist order them to?
The case against George left a lot of people feeling uneasy, and it seems
Well,
like
no
you are
shit.
included. Primarily because, all things considered, it was a thin case.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just think about how some people aren't arrested, and the case against them is pretty thick.
Right.
And in this instance, we know virtually nothing about George, Barry, and he's convicted, tried, and found guilty in no time.
Yeah.
All right, lickety split.
Yeah. He appealed twice, and both times his appeals were denied. But his third appeal was approved after it was revealed that the prosecution had left out a menial little tidbit about forensic evidence left at the scene because it didn't happen to match George.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that would be. How long did he know about this? How long did the prosecutor know about this other DNA evidence?
Well, I said he was found guilty and sentenced in July 2001, so we are now in November 2007.
I've been listening to different podcasts recently, long form true crime podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, and I'm asking this because I want to know if the same is true in the UK, but in the United States, if the prosecution finds information during discovery that would support the defense, they have to turn it over to the defense.
And if they don't, it's a Brady violation.
Correct.
Yeah.
Does the same thing apply in the UK?
I don't know the answer to that. All I know is at the beginning of August 2008, George was acquitted and released.
Well, thank goodness for that.
Mm-hmm.
Poor George. Actually, he could be a terrible person, but he didn't deserve to be tried and found guilty for murder.
Right.
Of a UK icon.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where the case stands.
We don't know who murdered her?
Mm-mm. We know that Jill Dando was a beacon. She was a regular fixture throughout British households, and she was murdered in cold blood.
Are you joking?
I'm not joking.
Okay.
That's what we know.
Okay, so what about these three men that we talked about?
Okay, those were just her romantic partners.
Oh, that was nothing to do with the case?
No, but I love the journey that you went on with that. But there have been many theories surrounding the identity or motive behind the murder of Jill Dando.
Okay, let's get to them because I feel like I might have some similar theories.
As you know,
Mm-hmm.
it is always the husband.
Duh.
So all the men who Jill had been romantically linked to were investigated.
Okay.
Shortly before her death, she had transferred £35,000 to Bob Wheaton.
Oh, the BBC exec.
Yes.
Okay.
Police believed this was a loan giving the jilted lover who owed Jill money a motive or two. But
why would the BBC exec owe her money?
I don't know. She gave him £35,000 and it ended up being a gift, and Wheaton, along with everyone else Jill had a relationship with, were ultimately rolled out. But that was the only thing that they were like, this £35,000, she's giving it to her ex, and her ex executive of the BBC partner. I don't know if there was maybe some sort of large transaction, like maybe they co-owned something,
Right.
or I don't know, but I know that it was determined that this was not the motive for her being gunned down on her doorstep.
In my head, in my slightly salacious and sensationalist mind, part of what I immediately thought and felt when you were talking about the lovers and you talked about Bob Wheaton
Mm-hmm.
and his status as an executive at the BBC is I was concerned that he was a jilted lover and he thought of himself as being entitled to more because he had helped Jill somehow in her career. And that makes a lot more sense to me about why he would harm her than 35,000 pounds.
Yeah, I don't know why they broke up. I don't know if that was a mutual thing or what the case may be, because it would be difficult to imagine that, because no matter what, he's in a position of power, but she's in a different position of power. But it would be difficult to imagine that she would end things with him in a way that was not amicable, because that would make work very uncomfortable.
Right. Well, also, she was the face.
Mm-hmm.
That's who people knew.
But he was the money.
There would be very little sympathy for, at least public sympathy, for the money
It's true.
versus the person.
Yeah.
So it seems, well, I say that, even if I thought it was going to be a miscalculation on his part, if he had something to do with it, he hasn't been caught yet.
That's true. Like I said, she did host Crime Watch for a while, and it was believed that since Crime Watch helped uncover the identities of criminals who would have otherwise gotten away with it, that her hosting the show made her a target for some seedy criminal willing to pay her back for whatever role they perceived her to have in this scenario. But also, it was determined to not be the likeliest scenario that somebody who almost got away with it was mad that she was the host of a show that helped bring them down,
Right.
or more accurately, hold them accountable or responsible. Naturally, the possibility of a deranged fan who had formed a parasocial relationship with Jill was also out there, but the police didn't end up finding anything that helped along these lines either.
I would assume that if it were an instance of this kind of parasocially connected fan who was fascinated or obsessed with Jill, in those instances, those people are usually, what is the right word? Boundary violators, right? Like it would have been nothing for them to have previously gone into her home.
So her brother Nigel did tell the police that she had become agitated in the days leading up to her death by a man who wouldn't leave her alone. But
Okay.
they weren't able to follow that lead anywhere.
Well, that seems to be the most sensical avenue at this point.
Possibly, but there are some more theories.
Okay.
I find this theory to be very unlikely, but they considered the possibility that this was a case of mistaken identity. There was an alleged BBC pedophile ring that Jill had been investigating and reported to BBC management, but that turned out to be more of a rumor than anything. Her agent, John Roseman, who had faxed the contracts Jill was going to her house to pick up, was even investigated by the police because he was the only person they could truly determine knew that she would be going to her former residence
Right.
because she hardly ever visited it.
Well, that also makes sense.
But Roseman, her agent, basically said in the Netflix series, he's not daft enough to have Jill killed because as her agent, she was bringing him a good amount of money.
That also makes sense.
Right. In 1999, during the Kosovo War, in which the UK and NATO opposed Serbia, NATO carried out a bombing campaign in Serbia. 3 weeks prior to Jill's death, she had been shown requesting support for refugees of Serbia.
Oh.
After Jill's murder, calls came in stating that the murder had been an act of revenge, a retaliation for the Serbian bombing. More deaths were threatened in these calls, but they weren't believed to have much credibility. Some of the confusion with who would have perpetrated this act against Jill Dando was that the gun was of a relatively poor quality, which made police believe this was not some assassination carried out by a professional, another theory that was touted. But the barrel of the gun had been pressed to the back of Jill's head after she'd complied with an order to get on the ground.
Okay.
And like I said before, By pulling the trigger with it placed against her head, the head itself acted as a suppressor, which explains why people did not hear anything that sounded like a gunshot. It also would prevent the killer from being covered in blood, so it did seem like it had been pulled off with some level of sophistication. So there's this disconnect between the quality of the gun not being what you would attribute to somebody who was a professional hit person, and then the manner in
The
which
technique. Yeah.
being more in line with somebody who did have those types of skills or training.
Okay. I understand that perspective. So is there official thought that she was forced onto the ground before she was shot, or is that just a theory that's floating?
I think that she was forced onto the ground
Okay.
or told to get down and then shot execution style.
Okay.
In 2019, the British NCIS issued a report that stated they believed Jill was, in fact, murdered in retaliation for the bombing campaign executed against Serbia, noting that the homemade markings on the bullet matched the markings of assassinations that had been carried out in Germany shortly before Jill's death.
How could it have taken them that long to put that together?
I don't know that it took them that long to put it together. I think it took them that long to release that information or to make that statement.
So you think they were playing it close to see what they could?
I think that, in similar to when police hold their cards close to their chest because the case is still open, it's still an open investigation. I think that they maybe had this information, but it was a matter of national security.
Right.
So
I wonder if there was fear that it could have caused more international upset if they had announced that a pro-Serbian group, or not a pro-Serbian group, but
a retaliatory group.
Yeah, a Serbian hate group made efforts to act terroristically and kill a BBC personality.
So further bolstering this theory, a Serbian journalist had been killed in identical circumstances to Jill's killing.
Wow.
So again, there's the idea of retaliation, eye for an eye type killing, and choosing somebody that would be impactful.
Okay.
4 Serbian Secret Service agents were convicted of the murder of Jill Dando in 2019. But in 2024, the convictions were reversed after the men appealed.
Any information as to why they were charged and then why later they appealed and got off?
Not that I have.
Okay.
But that's 2024. I mean, that's where we're at right now. So I've got some information about the legacy that Jill Dando left behind.
Okay.
Jill was only 37 at the time of her death and therefore didn't have a will. So her father inherited the over 1 million pounds that Jill had. There's footage of her funeral procession throughout the streets of London where people lined the streets with flowers that they tossed on the hearse as it passed in order to pay their respects.
Wow.
On the 2nd anniversary of her death, the Jill Dando Institute of Crime Science was founded at University College London. BBC Television created a memorial garden in her name, designing it with a color scheme and plant selection that held special meaning for Jill.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. It sounds beautiful.
It does.
Because it seems very intentional to choose a color scheme and specific plants that held meaning for her. A BBC broadcast award was set up in her name, of which the recipient is able to study journalism. And the first woman to receive this award and subsequent scholarship came from Weston-super-Mare, Jill's hometown. And in Weston, at the university where Jill had studied, a new building was named the Jill Dando Center. And that's the story of the unsolved murder of Jill Dando.
Wow, she held a lot of value amongst the people of the UK.
Yes, and I also think the timing of, and the likenesses that she and Princess Diana shared, and then the timing of their deaths being so close to one another, it was just almost like continuous grief.
Right.
For
like a triggering event or a re-traumatization of somebody or something to have buried the people's princess.
Well, and they're both beloved. They brought this joy and this like kindness that exuded from them that people felt. They felt a warmth from these women, and then to lose them in such tragic ways, so close together.
Yeah, just quick succession. Wow. I didn't know anything about Jill Dando before today, but now I feel like I know a lot.
Yeah. UK's sunflower. Britain's sunflower. That, to me, that detail where they said if Princess Di is Britain's rose, then Jill Dando is Britain's sunflower, that again contributed to this idea of a warmth and of a friendliness and somebody that they invited into their homes every single day, multiple times a day.
Is there any... Now I'm curious about the impact on the victim's family. I know that you said that her father inherited her estate.
Yes.
But other than Alan Farthing going on to be the Queen's gynecologist, was there ever any kind of notice about what that was like for him?
I mean, I think he was devastated. Everybody, Britain was devastated.
Right.
And he's a part of that.
Yeah, the whole island was devastated.
But no, I don't think that I found anything specific to him in my research. Just a lot of theories.
Yeah. And an incredible legacy. Well, that was an excellent case.
Thanks. It's unsolved, so I guess it could have been better.
Bam. Back to back.
Oh, yeah. You just did an unsolved case last week.
Cold case.
A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, please subscribe and drop us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening.
Make sure to recommend us to a friend and follow us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram.
And don't forget to like us on Facebook at Until the End of Crime and join our discussion group.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com. So send us questions, requests, or episode suggestions.
Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.